If you had the chance to tell people just one thing, what would it be? If you were given a microphone and a stage from which to share just one bit of wisdom, if you were given the chance to influence thousands of people by sharing just one piece of insight, something that you considered important, what would be that one thing that you would say to the world? The people who write messages that appear on church signs are faced with that very question every day, and I am consistently amazed with what they choose to share with the world, whizzing past their little marquees by the highway. Lots of churches have signs out front nowadays. You might have seen some of them. If you Google the word church signs, you can find some really interesting ones, actually. Some are cute, like the one at the church in Oklahoma that reads, "If God had a refrigerator, your picture would be on it." Some I saw made effective use of puns. One warned that forbidden fruits create many jams. Another one encouraged passersby to give God what's right, not what's left. And some were downright wise, like the one I found that read, "Before you criticize your wife's judgment, look at who she married." I know, right? But some of them I just find a little sad. There's one church in Fort Worth, Texas, that seemed to be suggesting that using our brains and having faith are mutually exclusive when they posted a sign in front of their sanctuary that read, "If your faith is big enough, facts don't count." Along that same line, there's a church near where I used to live in South Carolina whose sign out by the road threatens sort of menacingly, "You think it's hot now, don't die without being saved." And there used to be an old weathered billboard that I passed every time I drove home from college that read simply, "Turn to Jesus or burn in hell." Now, I'm not trying to quibble with anybody's theology. If that's what you believe, more power to you. But given the chance to share just one thing about your faith with others, I find it odd and a little troubling that so many folks would choose to share words of judgment and fear rather than words of God's grace and love. When they asked Jesus for that one thing, he said that it was to love God with all of your heart and soul and mind and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. You see, like signs in front of churches, you and I have the chance to say something profound every day to every person we meet, not necessarily with our words, but definitely with our actions. The question we each must answer is, what do we want that to be? How would you condense your life, your philosophy, your theology into a sentence or two that someone could grasp as they raced by on their daily journey? In his letter to the church in Philippi, Paul tells his readers exactly what he thinks that message should be. In the closing to his letter, when he is summing things up and offering his final thoughts, Paul writes to let your Epiekeis be known to everyone. Now, the New Revised Standard Version that we just read from translated that funny little Greek word Epiekeis into the word gentleness. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. And that's not entirely a bad translation. But the problem with translating from one language to another is that sometimes there isn't a word that means the same thing as the one that you're trying to translate. You need to say red in Spanish, there's a word for that, rojo. You need to find a pair of pants in a Juarez haberdashery, look for the sign that reads pantalones. But for Epiekeis, there isn't a direct English equivalent. Noted Bible scholar William Barclay, he of the familiar Daily Study Bible series, describes Epiekeis as, quote, "one of the most untranslatable of all Greek words." Well, thank you, William Barclay, for that. It is a concept that can be explained, but which is too difficult to capture in a word or two, which is why so many different translations of the Bible render it so many different ways. The King James Version, for instance, uses the word moderation, while the New American Standard Bible translates it as gentle spirit. The Douay-Rheims Bible uses modesty, while the Weymouth Bible renders it forbearing spirit. The Revised Standard Version probably gets closer with the word forbearance, which Merriam-Webster's Dictionary of Law defines as refraining from the enforcement of something that is due, like a debt or a right or an obligation. Bible paraphrases are usually less interested in translating the Bible word for word and rather work to capture the essence of the ideas in the text, The New Living Translation renders this passage, "Let everyone see that you are considerate in all that you do," while Eugene Peterson's The Message translates this passage as, "Make it as clear as you can to all that you meet that you're on their side, working with them and not against them." But however you translate epiekeis, it is the characteristic that Paul encourages his readers to exhibit, not just for the benefit of one another, but so that everyone can see. Epiekeis is what Paul wants the world to see when they look at the Philippian Christians. When they passersby stop and look at the sign out front of the first Christian church of Philippi, the message Paul wants people to see is epiekeis. William Barclay, again, wrote that the Greeks themselves explained epiekeis as justice and something better than justice. They said that epiekeis ought to come in when strict justice became unjust because of its generality. There may be individual instances where a perfectly just law becomes unjust, or where justice is not the same thing as equity. For instance, when a family in the depths of poverty is unable to pay their heating bills in the dead of winter, the company would be entitled to discontinue service until the debt was paid. But to do epiekeis would be for the company to choose not to enforce its right to collect and allow service to continue in order to make sure that the family could keep their heat on. In other words, to do epiekeis is to refrain from claiming your full rights and privileges if your keeping the letter of the law would mean that someone else gets hurt in the process. Jesus himself practiced epiekeis. In the story of the woman accused of adultery, Jesus steps in and saves her life. By Jewish law, if the woman was guilty of having committed adultery, she had to be put to death. But Jesus recognizes that while the crowd is about to fulfill its mandate by the letter of the law, justice will actually not be done. So he challenges them, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." You see, law is meant to serve the cause of justice, not the other way around. Jesus ran into this problem a lot with the Pharisees. They were keepers of the law, but Jesus knew that the law did not exist just to be kept. The law was meant to establish justice and right relationship with God. Jesus regularly healed on the Sabbath, and when the Pharisees complained that he and his disciples were picking grain on the Sabbath in direct violation of the fourth commandment, which forbids work on the Sabbath, Jesus replied that the Sabbath is made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. Now, we all know we have rights. For instance, I'll bet that if you've ever watched a police show on television, then you know that you have Miranda rights, and you probably know what they are. Can you say them with me? You have the right to remain silent. Seriously, say them with me. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you? Good. Book them, Dano. At least we know if, God forbid, we were ever arrested, we know what our rights are. Well done. Our Constitution guarantees us, among other things, the right to a trial by a jury, the right to vote, the right to free speech, the right to freely worship as we choose, as we're doing right now, the right to assemble peaceably, as we're also doing right now, and the right to keep and bear arms, as I hope none of you are doing right now. And we are encouraged to exercise those rights. But epiekeis is the act of self-restraint, when exercising our rights would be harmful to others. When speaking your mind would hurt someone else's feelings or damage their reputation, do epiekeis instead. When worshiping freely would be offensive or hurtful to those around you, do epiekeis instead. When keeping and bearing arms would put another person in danger, do epiekeis instead. Now, I think it's important to stop here for a moment and say that epiekeis does not mean relinquishing all your rights or having someone take them away. It means being aware of your neighbor, and as you move through life, making sure that justice and fairness for you does not mean that someone else gets the short end of the stick. Scholar Gerald Hawthorne writes that epiekeis is that considerate courtesy and respect for the integrity of others, which prompts a person not to be forever standing on his rights. And it is preeminently the character of Jesus. But our laws and our customs and our societal norms do not just protect our rights. They also make demands on us. Epiekeis is not just self-restraint regarding our legal rights. Epiekeis also means going beyond what is expected of us or even what is required of us. In other words, while epiekeis means not claiming everything to which you have a right, it also means doing more for other people than anyone has a right to expect. It is this epiekeis that we see featured so prominently in the story of Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi, that we read earlier. Ruth is not bound to stay with her mother-in-law after the tragic passing of her husband. Furthermore, Ruth is a woman of Moab, and Deuteronomy says of the Moabites, "No Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. You shall never promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live." So Ruth had every reason to expect that if she went with Naomi back to Judah, she would not be welcomed. And besides, her own family was in Moab. Like her sister-in-law Orpah, it would have been perfectly understandable and even expected that the widow Ruth would return to her own parents and to her own place of birth. But Ruth went beyond what was expected of her and what was required of her by custom in the law. Ruth stayed with Naomi and even worked each day gleaning in the fields to provide for Naomi's daily needs. Ruth gets close to Boaz and convinces him to marry her. When she gives birth to a son, the writer of Ruth notes that it was Naomi who nursed the child and that the women of the town say a son is born to Naomi. By her acts of epiekeis, Ruth was a blessing to her mother-in-law, not just in showing loyalty and providing for her physical needs, but in essentially giving her back the sons that she had lost and restoring to her joy where before there had been only deep sorrow. Epiekeis is the good Samaritan stopping to help an injured stranger when he's not required to, and when doing so actually puts him at risk too. Epiekeis is the father of the prodigal son, rushing out to meet him when no such grace-filled reaction is required or even expected of him. Epiekeis is Jesus' response to the disciples when they report that the hour is getting very late and the people gathered to hear Jesus need to be sent away so they can find something to eat. You give them something to eat, Jesus says. But what he might as well have said was, do epiekeis. Epiekeis is the story of Angela Prattis of Chester Township, just outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A mother of 3 children of her own, Ms. Prattis noticed that a lot of the children in her neighborhood were going without lunch during the summer months when school lunches were not available. So she began to feed them under a tent on her own front driveway. Each day, about 60 children from her neighborhood, where the average annual income hovers around $19,000 a year, gather at her home for a free, healthy lunch. The lunches are funded by the State Department of Education and administered by the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, who provides the meals. Why does she do it? Not because she has to, but because she wants to. In an interesting twist that helps us encompass all that epiekeis means, the town council has told her to stop because she doesn't have the proper permits. She files weekly reports, and she's visited by a state worker every other week, yet the town is trying to shut her down because she is in violation of a town zoning ordinance. By the letter of the law, the town council is right, and Angela Prattis is wrong. But if the law is strictly observed, children will go hungry. Epiekeis would be the town council recognizing that their zoning rules, meant to be just and fair, are standing in the way of real justice being done. Epiekeis is Angela Prattis, who has no obligation to help, extending herself beyond what everyone would expect of her, not only working to feed the least of these, but taking on the power of local government and the threat of fines in the process. But you don't have to open a feeding program in your front yard to do epiekeis. Epiekeis is making the effort to see things from another perspective. In a society that is increasingly divisive and divided, epiekeis is walking a mile in another person's shoes and making the effort to understand why they think and act the way they do. It doesn't mean excusing other people. It means understanding them. Epiekeis is leaving the last biscuit for someone else. It's going through the line first, but making sure others behind you have plenty to eat too. Epiekeis is being patient and kind, even when it's undeserved. It's biting your tongue and keeping the harsh words in, even when you're being provoked. Epiekeis is saying yes to Habitat for Humanity. It's saying yes to helping serve families at the Y shelter tonight. It's saying yes to your children when you'd rather be playing golf or watching the ball game. I met a man recently who was wearing a Georgia Bulldogs hat, and when I asked him if he was a fan, he said yes, but he hadn't seen a game in several years because, well, he's a single parent, and he only has one TV, and his son really likes the Wiggles. Epiekeis is when someone asks you for help, thinking not, what is the least I could do, and thinking, what is the most I could do? What do people see when they look at us? For Paul, it should be Epiekeis. For Paul, the life of the disciple is defined by the willingness to restrain oneself from claiming all that the law allows, if to do so would hurt others, while at the same time giving more of ourselves than is expected or required. This is not something that we do some of the time or whenever it's convenient. Epiekeis is what should define our lives all the time. Paul reminds the Phillipians to let Epiekeis be known to everyone, not just those in the church or those who are also believers, but everyone. To do Epiekeis then is to be always about the work of the kingdom. It is to be always making sure that custom and law do not define the limits to which we are willing to go to love and serve God by loving and serving God's people. So when you are determining what words to put on the billboard of your life, consider Epiekeis. When people look at you, strive to ensure that what they see is Epiekeis. When someone gives you the chance to say something important, say Epiekeis. And then take a few minutes to show them what that looks like. To God be all honor, glory, power, and dominion in this world and in the world that is to come. Amen.